Miss Marple and the Widow's Walk to the Well. Chapter 1. Wednesday Tea and the Murmur in the Hedge. The sun fell gently on St. Mildred's Gardens, the most peaceful corner of the picturesque village of Merton Barton. It was a Wednesday like any other, and yet things were about to change. In the conservatory of Mrs. Weatherby's house, china cups clinked prettily as a group of ladies, all of a respectable age and curious disposition, ate lemon biscuits and, as was their custom, discussed other people's affairs with the indulgent air of those watching a play. Among them, sitting with her hands folded in her lap and a barely perceptible smile, was Miss Jane Marple, with her perfectly arranged white hair and a gaze that, beneath her drooping eyelids, registered more than her mouth revealed. She observed, for example, how Mrs. Penelope Hartley sweetened her tea with 3 spoonfuls of sugar, even though she claimed to be on a strict diet, or how Miss Clare Morley avoided meeting Widow Lancaster's eyes from the moment she entered. And it was precisely the Widow Lancaster who, with her slow gait and immaculate mourning, became the involuntary centre of attention that afternoon. "Are you going out again tonight, my dear?" Mrs. Weatherby asked, feigning interest but already savouring the juicy comment she would later share with her gardener. Mrs. Lancaster, tall, slim, with hair tied back in a low bun, put her cup down on the saucer with a hollow sound and tilted her head slightly. "Yes, I find it soothing to walk at dusk," she replied softly. "The path leading to the old well seems especially comforting." The silence that followed was brief but heavy. The word wellet had a peculiar resonance in Merton Barton. Years earlier, a little girl had disappeared in the area, and although it was said that she had gone with relatives, there was never any certainty. "It's a dangerous place," Clare Morley said with a hint of sharpness. "That path isn't well lit. And why would anyone want to see clearly at night?" The widow shrugged. "Important things are rarely visible." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, still slowly stirring her tea. A strange response, no doubt. But more than that, it was the tone in which she'd said it, neither melancholic nor philosophical, but provocative. The rest of the tea was spent in distracted conversation, until Widow Lancaster rose gracefully, nodded, and walked down the stone path, her black dress billowing in the evening wind. "She's getting stranger and stranger, isn't she, Jane?" whispered Mrs. Weatherby as they watched the widow's figure recede through the hedges. Miss Marple did not reply. She was watching the grandfather clock in the hall, whose hands had stopped at exactly 7:23, which wouldn't have been important, except that Mrs. Lancaster had gone out at exactly that time the last 3 times as well. That night, as if the entire town had known it in advance, the unexpected happened. The next morning, the Weatherby's young gardener, Tom Hughes, tripped over something halfway along the path leading to the old well. At first, he thought it was an abandoned coat, until he noticed the edge of a shoe sticking out of the undergrowth. And beside the lifeless body of the Widow Lancaster rested a small bronze figure, a stork with its wings spread, that no one in the village could remember ever having seen. Her Carrie, Miss Marple, from the gate of her garden, had already sensed it before the commotion began. "Not all widows walk alone at night for no reason," he murmured, adjusting his hat, "and certainly none of them die without a story behind them." Chapter 2. The Murmur under the Wisteria. The discovery of Mrs. Lancaster's body spread through Merton Barton like the scent of wisteria in spring. Subtle at first, but soon enveloping, persistent, impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, word had spread throughout the village. The local police, led by Inspector Craddock, a man of formal manners and a remarkable resistance to village gossip, had cordoned off the path to the well, and the press had yet to arrive. But they didn't need to. The residents of Merton Barton were perfectly capable of creating their own narrative. At the grocery store, Mrs. Woodley was already offering 3 different versions of the crime, all contradictory, but equally vivid. "Told Bernard that woman wasn't well," he commented while weighing sugar for a customer. "Walking around alone like a lost soul. That's not normal, it's not." Inside the tea room, beneath a trembling wisteria vine, Claire Morley sipped her coffee in complete silence. Opposite her, Penelope Hartley played with her spoon, not taking a bite. "Did you know he kept a diary?" Penelope murmured without looking at her companion. "He carried it everywhere. It was a red leather one. They say it never turned up among his things." Claire looked up quickly. "Says who?" "I heard it at the bakery. They told Edith, and you know how she is. She doesn't hold anything back. And what kind of things would a widow write in a diary?" Claire asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Well, things you don't want to say out loud, I guess." At the drawing-room door, Miss Marple listened from the shadows, appearing to inspect the cake menu. It wasn't her style to barge into conversations, but she did have an enviable knack for being exactly where secrets were trying to escape. Claire Morley's face, so composed, had a barely perceptible rigidity, and it was this rigidity that made Miss Marple recall something she had noticed days before. How Claire had avoided Mrs. Lancaster during Mass the previous Sunday. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but not natural. Later, in the main square, Inspector Craddock was talking with Dr. Sims, who had performed the initial examination of the body. Miss Marple, sitting on her usual bench by the rosebush, was reading a detective novel, a habit many viewed as a mere pastime, but which for her served as a barometer of fiction compared to real life. "Blow to the base of the skull," the doctor said in a low tone, but unable to avoid a certain theatricality. Precise, but not immediate. Perhaps with a heavy figure. "Did you see it? That little bronze statuette. Strange, very detailed." Craddock nodded, frowning. "And no fingerprints. Not one. And the bag? Empty. No wallet, no keys, no red diary you mentioned. So someone knew what they were looking for." That last sentence seemed to stir something in Miss Marple's mind. She gently closed her book, stood up, and walked quietly home. It wasn't her custom to butt in so early, but she'd already felt that tickle in her neck, that ancient sure intuition that told her something wasn't right. A few hours later, Claire Morley stood outside the gate of Miss Marple's garden, pretending to look at the flowers. "It's not a good day, is it?" he said, barely raising his voice. "No, my dear, it isn't," Miss Marple replied from her rocking chair. "Even though the sun is shining, sadness has a habit of hiding in the rays." Claire didn't know what to say. She pressed her lips together and kept walking. And while the village followed the thread of gossip, Miss Marple began to unravel the crime, calmly, patiently, because, as she well knew, the truth rarely comes out in plain sight. It must be lured out of hiding gently. Chapter 3. A whisper in the seam of silence. Evening descended on Merton Barton with that golden light that transforms the ordinary into something almost sacred. But beneath that veneer of serenity, unrest had coiled like an invisible cobweb between the houses, the hedges, and the souls of the neighbours. In Mrs. Dulcie Langdon's haberdashery, fingers sewed more out of habit than necessity. The thread ran through the fabric as the words were woven together, sharper than an embroidery. "Needle, I say," Dulcie began, stealing a glance at the customer across the counter. "Isn't it strange that Mrs. Lancaster died just the night before she was due to leave?" "Travel?" Mrs. Tilling asked, her eyes wide. "Where to?" "To Sussex. She told me a few days ago that she was going to visit a distant niece. She seemed nervous, like she wanted to get out of here as soon as possible." Mrs. Tilling nodded slowly, picking up her packet of buttons with steadier hands than usual. The idea of a widow planning to leave and failing was the kind of detail that at Merton Barton quickly turned into unspoken suspicion, and worse, silent judgment. Meanwhile, at the rectory, Reverend Hardwick was reviewing the parish register, distracted by the rhythmic tapping of the soft rain on the windows. Something was bothering him. Mrs. Lancaster had requested a private meeting 2 weeks earlier, insisting she needed to make a confession. But when the time came, she didn't say anything specific. She just sat, stared at the crucifix for a long moment, and then stood up muttering, "Sometimes forgiveness isn't God's doing, but man's." Now, those words seemed to resonate with another meaning. At Miss Marple's house, the cherry trees were beginning to shed their first petals of the season. Jane Marple, sitting at her desk with a small notebook, scribbled names. Not theories yet, just names, gestures, subtle contradictions. And one of them had a circle around it. Claire Morley. There was something about Claire's behaviour that didn't quite fit. She didn't shy away from the subject like some others. She spoke about the crime with a kind of almost controlled curiosity, like someone who wanted to know exactly what was known, but didn't seem too interested. Jane Marple had met many people like that during her years at St. Mary Mead. People who protected themselves with a veneer of composure, but whose insides seethed with poorly extinguished secrets. And then there was the matter of the diary. In a town like Merton Barton, where even the contents of someone's refrigerator could reach outside ears, it was impossible for an object like that to have gone unmentioned before. He then decided to visit someone who rarely spoke, but who saw everything. Tom Hughes's small shed was filled with tools, gardening gloves, and broken flower pots. The young gardener, barely 20 years old, greeted her with a shy smile and his hands full of soil. "Miss Marple," she said, wiping herself on her apron, "what brings you here?" "Oh dear, you're just a curious old lady. I was thinking of planting some hydrangeas, and you're reputed to make them bloom like the Queen's gardens." Tom blushed, but his gaze hardened as soon as he heard Mrs. Lancaster's name. "How did you find her, Tom?" she asked casually, as if she were talking about the weather. "She was there, like she'd tripped," he said, "but there was no mud on her dress, no leaves, nothing. Like someone had placed her, like a statue." Miss Marple nodded slowly. That word, placed, was key. The crime scene hadn't been natural. It was staged. And staged scenes, he knew well, are there to hide or send a message. "And that bronze figure?" he asked. "I've never seen her carry anything like that before. And I've been working in her garden for over a year. She had old ornaments, yes, but not that. That stalk was too polished. Modern, almost." When Miss Marple returned home, the sky had already turned pearly grey. She opened her notebook and drew a stalk. Next to it, she wrote a single word, symbol. Whatever that object was, it didn't belong to the widow. It belonged to the murderer. And if it was a symbol, it was also a signature. Chapter 4. The Stork That Never Flew. The night in Merton Barton was so quiet that a cat's footsteps on the A gate could have seemed like a distant drum. However, in Miss Marple's library, the sound of pages turning broke the silence with cadence. Jane had removed a small volume from the shelves that barely attracted attention. Symbols in English folklore. I had bought it out of sheer curiosity at a flea market years ago, but I had never read it in full, until now. He ran his index finger over the yellowed pages until he stopped at an illustration. A stork with its wings outstretched, a harbinger of revelation or transition, used in ancient times as a symbol in certain occult societies to indicate a new beginning or a truth. Coming to light, Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. She wasn't superstitious, nor was she given to esoteric ideas, but she knew well that some people used symbols not for what they meant, but for what others would believe they meant. And that was a crucial difference. The next morning, she walked with a firm but calm step to the small local library. There, Mr. Archer, an elderly man with eyebrows like wings and a tendency toward impatience, greeted her with a grimace that, on him, was equivalent to a smile. "Are you looking for something special, Miss Marple?" "Actually, yes," she replied, politely. "I'm looking for any records of local associations, civic groups, book clubs, charitable societies, from last year." Mr. Archer glanced at her, suspecting she wasn't after light reading, but nodded. "They're in the back filing cabinet. You'll need to dust them a bit." "Oh, dust has never bothered me," she said with a slight smile. In the small file cabinet, among crisp papers and folders piled in no apparent order, Jane found a list of participants in the so-called Merton Circle of Friends, a social club that held monthly meetings to discuss cultural topics. It was a tiny detail that made her frown, a marginal note in blue ink next to Claire Morley's name. Leader of the Literary Symbolism Group. How convenient, thought Miss Marple, and jotted the detail down in her notebook before gently closing the file. Meanwhile, at the Morley house, Claire was alone. She had closed the curtains, even though it was midday, and she held a yellowed letter in her hands, its corners already bent from use. She read it once more, even though she knew every word. It was from Mrs. Lancaster. Brief, direct, a single sentence. "I know what you did, and I'll write it all down." Claire trembled. She'd burned the envelope, but not the letter. She couldn't. Something inside her needed her, like someone who keeps a wound open so they don't forget it's bleeding. Almost at the same time, Reverend Hardwick received an unexpected visitor at the rectory. Penelope Hartley, dressed more colourfully than usual, sat down in the office chair as if she'd forgotten what she was doing there. "Reverend, you knew Mrs. Lancaster well, didn't you?" "As well as anyone," said the Reverend, folding his hands. "Did he ever mention a child to you?" The Reverend stared at her. A child? Yes, or rather, a baby. I heard, well, someone said that she had one a long time ago, but she never acknowledged it. The Reverend blinked uncomfortably. That's no matter for gossip, Mrs. Hartley. No, of course not, she said, lowering her voice. But what if the past was what killed her? Miss Marple appeared at the rectory a few minutes later, as if guided by the wind. The Reverend was pleased and surprised. Well, Miss Marple, 2 visitors in one day. What chance brings you here? I don't believe in chance, Reverend. I believe in opportunity, she replied gently. And I thought it appropriate to ask if Mrs. Lancaster ever mentioned being blackmailed. Hardwick paled. Not with that word, but he did say something, one autumn afternoon, that he'd made an omission, that someone knew. He said no more. Jane nodded slowly. Mrs. Lancaster's past wasn't simply tragic. It was shared. And among those who shared it, one or more were now silent out of fear. As he left the rectory, he saw Claire Morley talking to the postman, with the same polite smile as always, but this time her hand was shaking. Not from the cold, but from something older. Guilt. Miss Marple, walking slowly along the sidewalk, thought of the bronze stork. Its restrained expression, its symbolism, and how some secrets weigh more than a metal figure. Chapter 5. The Silence Under the Child's Picture. A gentle breeze swept through Merton Barton that morning, barely rustling the lace curtains of the open windows and filling the air with the scent of honeysuckle. Everything seemed to be returning to its usual rhythm. Children were playing in the square, the butcher was waving from his stall, and the mill horses were patiently pulling their loads. But that tranquillity had a different quality, like a well-known symphony with a barely perceptible, discordant note. At the Morleys' house, Claire paced the living room like a figure trapped in her own reflection. On the wall above the fireplace hung a small painting that no one seemed to notice. The portrait of a boy about 3 years old, with light eyes and wavy hair. It had always been there, but no one had ever spoken about it. Miss Marple, however, had noticed it as she passed the house, not because of the art, but because of what didn't fit. The date in the corner. 1932. That same year, Mrs. Lancaster was living in London. Years later, she returned to Merton Barton, alone. No children, no visible family. And yet, that painting seemed more like a tribute than a casual decoration. An unidentified child, an illegible signature, and perhaps a truth hidden beneath the paint. Meanwhile, in Detective Inspector Craddock's office, progress was slow. The statuette's fingerprints had been sent to the regional police station, but the report had come back unremarkable. No DNA trace, no identifiable fingerprints. It was as if the killer had taken the time and the care to erase all traces. And the diary? Craddock asked young Officer Willis. Nothing? Nothing yet, sir. We've searched Mrs. Lancaster's house from top to bottom. Craddock sighed. So someone took him before we arrived, and that someone knew exactly what they were looking for. At that moment, Miss Marple was gently knocking on the office door. "Inspector Craddock," he said with a friendly smile, "I was wondering if you could help me with a small question." "Of course, Miss Marple, although I suppose there's more to your question than meets the eye." She sat down with her usual composure. It's just a remark about the painting at Miss Morley's. A curious-looking boy. I wondered if anyone had asked about him. Craddock raised an eyebrow. A child? Morley has children? Not that we know of. And yet that portrait has been hanging there for years. I saw it myself a long time ago, but no one knows who the child is. Craddock frowned. And you suggest— Not suggesting anything yet, she replied. Only that sometimes, Inspector, portraits serve to remember, or to atone. Leaving the police station, Miss Marple headed straight for Mrs. Peabody's frame shop. She was not only an expert in wood and glass, but also in unsolicited stories. "Ah, Jane," the woman said upon seeing her, "have you come for your flower stamps?" "Not this time, dear. I wanted to ask you if you remember an old commission, a medium-sized walnut frame for a child's portrait." Mrs. Peabody, without needing to consult records, nodded. "Of course. It was a few years ago. Claire Morley brought it. She said it was a family heirloom. She didn't mention the child." "Nadville. Who painted the portrait? It wasn't original. It was a copy." I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to say anything. She had that way of looking at me that didn't invite questions. Miss Marple thanked him and left. The information was important. A copied portrait lovingly framed but never mentioned. An image kept alive, perhaps out of guilt. Later, as the last rays of day touched the roof tiles, Miss Marple had tea with Penelope Hartley in her garden. Penelope, as she had so often before, couldn't resist the temptation to share what she'd been holding back. "Jane, I think Claire and Mrs. Lancaster had something in common. I don't know what exactly, but years ago they argued in church, when they thought no one was listening. They were talking about a child, one who should never be mentioned." Miss Marple calmly raised her cup, though inside she was already putting the pieces together. They weren't final yet, but they were beginning to form the outline of a past that had been buried beneath respect, shame, and fear. That night, in his notebook, he wrote 3 names: Claire Morley, Widow Lancaster, the child without a name. And beneath them, a question that united it all: what truth demanded to be silenced, and who was willing to kill for it? Chapter 6. The Letter That Was Never Delivered. Merton Barton's postman, Alfred Beach, wasn't a man given to introspection. He delivered letters punctually, greeted people politely, and kept his opinions close to his chest, like the sealed envelopes that passed through his hands. But in the days following Mrs. Lancaster's murder, something gnawed at him inside. I couldn't stop thinking about an envelope that had never reached its destination. It was a grey morning, 2 days before the crime, when he picked up a packet of mail from the mailbox in front of the widow's house. Among the envelopes, one caught his eye. Not because of the recipient, Claire Morley, in careful handwriting, but because, upon picking it up, he noticed the stamp was poorly affixed, and like a good public servant, he decided to reinforce it before delivering it. But as he did so, he saw something he never forgot. The back of the sheet, visible through transparency, had a single line written in black ink. "If you don't talk, I will." He sealed it and handed it over. And now, with Mrs. Lancaster dead, and the glances growing ever more inquisitive, Alfred felt that this silent gesture, the involuntary glance, made him part of history. Meanwhile, Miss Marple strolled along the path that bordered the old school, where the cherry trees were timidly blossoming. She liked to wander aimlessly when an idea needed to take shape. It wasn't yet a deduction, rather a shadow of understanding that followed her like the rustling of dry leaves. Claire Morley, the child in the portrait, the threatening letter, and the figure of the stork. On his way home, he found an unexpected note in his mailbox. No signature, no greeting, no context, just 5 words written in firm handwriting. She never got over it. Come on! It didn't say who she was or what she should overcome. But the envelope came from the old bookstore that now bore the name of Rarity and Season A Shop, that, in its younger days, had been a meeting place for devoted readers, frustrated poets and a few young ladies with more secrets than books. Miss Marple put on her coat, grabbed her bag, and left without wasting any time. The bookstore was a narrow place with low ceilings and the smell of old paper. Behind the counter, an unexpected figure appeared. Edith Benton, a distant cousin of the late Lancaster and the town's former librarian. "Was it you who wrote this?" Miss Marple asked, showing the note. Edith nodded wordlessly and turned to a small shelf behind the counter. She took out a thin, linen-bound notebook with worn edges. She placed it on the counter with both hands. "This is the diary everyone's looking for," he said finally. "But I haven't handed it over to the police. Not yet." Jane Marple showed no surprise. She just nodded, and Edith continued. "Penelope brought it to me the same day of the crime. She said she found it under a chair cushion in the parsonage. She asked me to hide it until she knew if it contained anything harmful. Have you read it? Only bits and pieces. It talks about the child, about a secret adoption, about a mistake Mrs. Lancaster swore she'd never reveal. But then, apparently, someone threatened to expose it all." Miss Marple flicked through the notebook slowly. The handwriting was delicate but shaky on the last pages. One sentence, underlined twice, made her stop. "Claire knows. She always knew, but she pretends not to." And below, in more recent ink, "I can't keep quiet any more. If I don't face it, someone else will." As she left the bookstore, the wind seemed to get stronger. Jane Marple knew she was getting closer to the truth, but also on dangerous ground, not only because of the killer, but also because of the delicate balance of the past that many still nourished themselves on. That afternoon, he went to visit Penelope Hartley. He found her in her kitchen, her hands covered in flour and a tense expression. "Miss Marple," he said without surprise, "I thought you'd come." "I've read the diary," she said bluntly, "but not all the pieces fit together yet." Penelope looked down. "Mrs. Lancaster was my friend. And yes, she helped cover something up, but it wasn't out of malice. It was out of fear." "Afraid of what?" "To Claire. Or rather, to what Claire might do if the truth came out." Miss Marple watched her for a few seconds. "So, tell me, Penelope, do you think Claire Morley would be capable of killing?" Penelope didn't respond. She just stared at the bread, knife resting on the table, the blade facing her. That silence was more eloquent than any statement. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Name on the Birth Certificate. Dawn arrived with a strange stillness. The roosters crowed with less vigour, and the clock in the bell tower struck 7, 5 minutes behind, as if even time had become indecisive in Merton Barton. The entire village, although gradually returning to its routines, seemed to be walking on broken glass. And in the midst of this delicate tension, Miss Marple carefully tied her shoelaces and made a decision. She had to return to the past, but not her own, but to Mrs. Lancaster's, and to the boy everyone pretended not to know. That same morning, he travelled to the Combe St. Anne Town Hall, where the region's civil records of births, deaths and marriages were kept. It was a grey stone building, sober and quiet, with clerks as methodical as the dates they sorted. Miss Grantham, the senior archivist, was a bony woman with a high-pitched voice and a prodigious memory for local surnames. "Lancaster, you said?" he repeated, leafing through a brown, leather-bound register. Yes, here she is, Emma Lancaster, born in 1896, married in 1919 to a Bernard Ellis, divorced in 1926, no children recorded. Miss Marple nodded, as if confirming a fact she already knew. "And could you search for births registered in 1932 in the London area, with the mother registered as Emma Lancaster, or even Emma Ellis?" Miss Grantham frowned but didn't object. She preferred the challenge to the bureaucracy. "Let's see. Here's something. A boy, born in May 1932. Mother, Emma Ellis, unmarried. Father, unrecorded. Child's name. Ah, this is curious. What's wrong?" asked Miss Marple, bending down gently. The name was crossed out. He was originally registered as Thomas, but there's a marginal note that says name expunged, new registration issued in confidential adoption. And that's it. Miss Marple slowly straightened up. She didn't need any more. Thomas, that name was no stranger. He returned to Merton Barton, his mind racing. He knew he'd heard that name in another context, and it was as he passed Mrs. Weatherby's garden that the connection became crystal clear. Tom Hughes, the young gardener who had found the body. The boy with light eyes and wavy hair, the same one who, according to the village's old tongues, was raised by a distant aunt in the suburbs of Wetherham, and who had arrived in Merton Barton just 5 years earlier in search of his roots. What if he didn't know? What if all this time he had been working in his own mother's garden, without knowing it? That same afternoon, Miss Marple asked Tom to help her move some flower pots in her garden. He came with his usual good graces, oblivious to the turmoil swirling around his life. "Do you mind if I ask you a personal question, Tom?" she said as they arranged the pots. "Did you ever meet his parents?" Tom smiled, somewhat uncomfortable. "No, ma'am. My aunt told me my mother died shortly after I was born. I never heard anything more. And you never felt curious?" "Of course, but whenever I asked, she changed the subject. She told me some things are better left where they are." Miss Marple looked at him sweetly. That's what adults do when they don't know how to handle a burning truth. "Tom, have you ever seen this portrait?" he asked then, taking out a small copy he had made of the painting hanging in Claire's house. The young man looked at him, and his eyebrows furrowed. "I saw it at Miss Morley's house once. I thought it was odd. It looks like a photograph of me as a child. I thought it was a coincidence." Miss Marple didn't respond. The reaction was enough. The doubt had already been planted in her mind. Meanwhile, inside her home, Claire Morley was pulling a wooden box from the back of a closet. Inside were crumpled letters, undated photographs, and a birth certificate, yellowed with age, on which her name was not listed at all, only her mother's, Emma Lancaster. He sighed, as if finally letting go of a lie that was too heavy to bear. That night, Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, Thomas was adopted in secret. Claire knew. Perhaps she saw him as a threat. Mrs. Lancaster wanted to reveal it. She was warned, blackmailed, and then silenced. The key is not who killed, but who was afraid that it would be known who that child had belonged to. And under those words he wrote 3 initials without underlining them. C.M. Chapter 8. The Last Tea at Morley House. The sky above Merton Barton was covered with low, heavy clouds, as if the firmament itself sensed what was about to happen. Rain didn't fall, but the air had that metallic taste that precedes a storm. Inside Claire Morley's elegant but sober house, everything was set up as on any other afternoon. The white tablecloth, the china cups, the lemon scones neatly lined up on a silver platter. However, Claire moved like an automaton, with mechanical gestures and an absent gaze. He had invited Miss Marple over for tea. It was an unexpected invitation, but one that wasn't rejected. Jane Marple, with her navy blue hat pulled down low and her wool coat pulled up to her neck, arrived punctually, greeting everyone with her usual courtesy. "How lovely to see you, Claire," she said as she entered, accepting the coat her hostess offered her, "though the weather is turning downright unpleasant." "Perhaps it's appropriate," Claire replied quietly. "Some truths require grey skies." She poured the tea with precise movements, but Miss Marple didn't miss the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the teapot, nor did she ignore the slight stain on the edge of a napkin, blue ink like an old-fashioned fountain pen, nor the complete absence of flowers in the vases, unusual for someone whose house was always neat and ornate. "You know," Claire said, sitting up straight, "I've been thinking about my mother. We didn't talk much, but she was a strong woman, sometimes cruel, always controlling." Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. She let the silence settle in like a third guest in the room. "I wonder, Claire," he said finally, "if what troubles you most is not what your mother did, but what you allowed her to do." Claire looked up slowly. Her eyes, grey and cold, now had a suppressed shine, like tears that would never spill. "Allow," he repeated. "What an indulgent word!" A distant thunder rumbled, soft but steady. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall on the glass. "Are you here to accuse me, Miss Marple?" "I'm here because someone died," Jane replied calmly, "and because I know when an unspoken truth begins to rot from the inside." Claire stood up, walked to the fireplace, and stared into the dying embers. "She stole something from me, and then she pretended nothing had happened. I was a child. I grew up knowing something was wrong, that there was someone else, an absent presence. And one day, when I finally asked, she told me she'd done what was necessary, that some decisions are made to protect the family name. And you believed her." Claire slowly turned her head. "I wanted to." He walked over to a small desk in the corner of the room and took out an envelope. He wordlessly handed it to Miss Marple. Inside was an old photograph. A young woman, Emma Lancaster, still unburdened by mourning, holding a baby wrapped in a blanket. Beside her, a girl of 5 or 6, looking confused. "Claire, I found it a few weeks ago," Claire said. And then a letter, in her own handwriting. It was never sent. It was addressed to me. He took out another piece of paper, this time folded in 3. He opened it and read, "Claire, I've never known how to tell you what you deserve to know. In my mistakes, I made you an accomplice without giving you a voice. The child wasn't a burden. He was a decision. The only one I made not out of duty, but out of love. You are not alone. You never were. Forgive me if you can." Emma Miss Marple let out a barely audible sigh, not of relief, but of regret. "So why didn't you tell him when he was still alive?" "Because it was too late. I'd already sent the threat. I'd already left the diary in plain sight. I'd already decided that if she didn't talk, I would. I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted to force her. But someone else intervened first." Miss Marple looked up. "Anyone else?" Claire bit her lip. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't kill her, Miss Marple, I swear. The last time I saw her, it was in church. But she wasn't alone. I saw someone leaving her house later while it was raining. I didn't know who it was until Tom told me something today." "Tom?" "Yes. He asked me about the painting. He said it looked like a photo of him as a child, and when I looked at it, I knew who he was." Silence returned to the room, heavy as the air before a storm. Miss Marple watched closely. She knew that confession was honest, but not complete. There were still pieces off the board. Tom, the son; Claire, the displaced daughter; Emma, the mother with secrets; and someone else. Someone who knew everything before anyone else, and who acted. Chapter 9. The Hand That Knew Too Much. The rain fell heavily during the night, drumming on the rooftops of Merton Barton, and filling the gutters with water with a constant monotonous murmur. The lights in the houses flickered behind the steamed windows, and the dogs didn't bark, as if the entire village were gathering around something that couldn't yet be named. In her living room, Miss Marple wrote by the light of a small lamp, with precise strokes. What she had before her wasn't yet a solution, but it was a clear map of pain. A mother who hid a child. A daughter who grew up in the shadow of a secret. A young man without knowing where he came from, searching without searching. And someone else. A hidden hand, a loose piece. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Miss Marple walked steadily to the parsonage. Reverend Hardwick greeted her with a certain resignation. He already knew that Miss Marple never arrived out of empty courtesy. "Would you like to come into the office?" he asked with forced politeness. "Thank you, Reverend. I'll be brief," she said, sitting down carefully. "I just want to confirm one detail. Did Mrs. Lancaster confess to you recently?" Hardwick hesitated. "I asked him not to say anything." "I'm not interested in the religious details, Reverend, but in what he left out. Did he tell you about a letter?" The Reverend frowned, then nodded ruefully. "Yes, he said he'd written an important letter, but he didn't know whether to send it. He asked me for advice. I suggested praying. I didn't hear any more. That letter was never sent. But someone found it, someone who knew enough to understand its contents and fear it. Hardwick leaned forward, his voice deep. "Are you saying it wasn't a revenge crime, but a crime of fear?" "Exactly." Miss Marple stood up. "Thank you, Reverend." Once outside, the drizzle had turned to mist. The town seemed to float between water and memory, and there, like a ghost among the hedges, appeared Penelope Hartley. She wasn't walking anywhere. She was just looking. When Miss Marple approached her, she noticed something different in her expression. She was no longer the chatty friend, but a woman caught in an irreversible decision. "Jane," he whispered, "I have to tell someone." "Then walk with me," Miss Marple replied softly. They walked to the public garden, where drooping magnolias formed a white carpet. Penelope stopped by the farthest bench. "She told me everything, not in words, but I knew. Mrs. Lancaster. She told me with her eyes the day she brought the diary. I was scared, but also a kind of relief, like I could finally let go of something." Miss Marple nodded. "And what did you do?" "I took it with me. I hid it. I told Edith to look after it. I just wanted to protect her. I thought there was still time. But then Claire confessed to me that she'd threatened to reveal the secret. She was furious, beside herself. She said that woman had ruined her life, that she must pay. And then I went to see her. That night, the night of the murder. I thought I'd convince her to talk to Claire, to tell her the truth before it spread through the town like poison. But by the time I got there, she was already wounded." Miss Marple stood still. "Did you find her alive?" Penelope nodded, her eyes glassy. "I wanted to call someone, to scream, but he grabbed my wrist. He made me promise him something, to not say anything yet, to wait. He begged me, and then he died." They remained silent for a long time. Tom arrived shortly after. Penelope added in a small voice, "He didn't see everything, but I think he saw my shadow moving away from the path. He never said so, but he looks at me with a kind of silent doubt." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Penelope, you didn't kill her, but you were there, close enough to see something else." Penelope nodded, and then she said it. "There was a glove, lying near the body. Black, a man's, with embroidered initials JW." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. JWA name that hadn't figured in the gossip. A face no one had yet linked to the widow Lancaster. But Miss Marple already knew who it was, the retired town sheriff, Jack Weston. He had worked in the city before retiring. It was rumoured that he had had an affair with Mrs. Lancaster in his youth. He then married and disappeared from the social circle, until she returned to the village. Could he be the missing piece? The one who knew about the child from the beginning? Miss Marple didn't say it out loud, but inside her the last line of the diary came alive. The threat did not come from the one who shouts the loudest, but from the one who never raises his voice. Chapter 10. The Silence of the Old Sheriff. Jack Weston lived at the far end of Merton Barton, where the Esher village began to blur into open fields and time-forgotten footpaths. His house, a dark brick structure with narrow windows, remained perpetually shadowed, like its owner. Although he had retired from the role of sheriff years before, his presence still inspired a mixture of respect and distance. Miss Marple hadn't spoken to him in months, maybe longer. But that morning, while the sky still held a shade of indecisive grey, she showed up at his door with a small box of shortbread wrapped in a tartan scarf. She knew from experience that the truth is rarely found by confronting someone. It had to be surrounded, let it emerge alone. "Mr. Weston," he said when he opened the door, more stooped and thinner than she remembered. "I thought a little sweetness wouldn't hurt at this time of year." He looked at her silently for a few seconds. Then he nodded with a low grunt and ushered her in. The interior smelled of old wood and cold tobacco. Everything was in order, but with that functional cleanliness that only single men maintain. No embellishments, no gestures. A life on pause. "Thanks for the cookies," he murmured, slowly sitting down in a worn armchair. Miss Marple chose the chair closest to the unlit hearth. "I'm sorry my visit isn't purely out of courtesy," he said gently, "but there are matters that need to be discussed before they are silenced forever." Jack didn't respond. He just narrowed his eyes. His face was one of those that hides more in skin than in words. Deep wrinkles, angular cheekbones, lips that rarely opened for anything more than the essentials. "Many years ago," she continued, "you met Emma Lancaster. I know it's no secret, nor that something happened between you that ended unresolved." Weston looked out the window, but didn't interrupt. "You were a sheriff. You were married. She was a single mother. All very awkward, very inappropriate, very quiet. What do you want, Miss Marple?" he said at last, without raising his voice. "To find out if the secret she kept all this time was also hers." The man leaned forward, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. He was slow to speak, but when he did, his voice had a tired tone, rather than a guilty one. "She told me she was pregnant after, I offered to let us go away together, start over somewhere else, but she refused. She told me she didn't need anyone else, that she'd raise him alone, that she didn't want to tarnish the Weston name with something that would never be accepted. She didn't let me decide. And the child, she said she'd take care of it. But later, when I found out she'd given the baby up for adoption, Jack put a hand to his face. I wrote to her, for years, but she never replied." Miss Marple watched him closely. "And yet you came back to Merton Barton after all this time." "Why?" "Because she wrote to me," he said, almost bitterly. "She told me she wanted to put things right, that there was someone she should tell the truth to, but she didn't know how. She made an appointment with me the night she died. She asked me to meet her near the well, like old times." Miss Marple's heart beat fast under her woolen sweater. "Did you see her that night?" "Yeah, and they argued." Jack nodded, his eyes moist. "It wasn't violent, it was sad. She told me she was scared, that someone had threatened her, that her diary had been stolen. She told me that if anything happened to her, I should find the boy and tell him the truth myself." Miss Marple leaned a little towards him. "And then I left. She said she needed a moment alone. I didn't insist. I didn't think—" He stopped, swallowing. "I didn't think it was the last time." "A glove was found near the body," Miss Marple said quietly, "with her initials on it." Weston closed his eyes. "I lost it that night. I took it off to light a cigarette. I didn't realize I wasn't wearing it until much later." Why didn't he say anything? What would have changed? I would have been accused, or worse, she would have been made an object of shame. Again, I preferred to remain silent. Miss Marple stood up slowly. But there's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't mentioned. You saw someone else that night. Isn't that right? The old man didn't respond at first. Then, with a slow sigh, he nodded. Yes, someone who shouldn't have been there, who had no reason to know where Emma was. But she didn't see me. She just walked by, quickly, and I never saw that figure again. Could you recognize her? Jack Weston looked at her with a mixture of resignation and relief. If I had to bet, I'd say it was a woman. Light-coloured clothing, flat shoes. She walked like someone who knew the terrain by heart. Miss Marple nodded. Thanks, Jack. You've said more than you think. As she left the house, with the sky still overcast, Miss Marple stopped halfway. Light-coloured clothing, flat shoes. Only one woman in the village dressed like that at that hour. One who always went unnoticed. One who never raised her voice, but who always knew too much. Chapter 11. Edith Benton's Silent Game. The bookstore rarity and season. It still seemed like a harmless place. It occupied a quiet corner of the town, where the leaves fell unhurriedly, and the cobblestones retained the muffled echo of footsteps no one remembered. It was the kind of store that seemed to sell nothing, yet survived year after year, a refuge for silent readers, and perhaps for truths that didn't know how to escape. Miss Marple arrived at dusk, as the streetlights began to flicker, and the shop windows took on a nostalgic golden hue. Edith Benton sat in her usual corner, her glasses perched on her nose and a notebook open in front of her. Her expression, as always, was calm. Too calm, Miss Marple, he said when he saw her, without raising his voice. Are you looking for a particular edition? Not exactly, Jane replied, although I'm here to talk about a text, one you had in your hands before anyone else, The Diary of Emma Lancaster. Edith didn't flinch. She slowly closed the notebook and placed it on a shelf behind her. I told you, Jane. Penelope asked me to keep it. It wasn't mine. I didn't read more than a few lines. Are you sure about that? Edith looked up. Her eyes, grey as a calm sea, stared into Miss Marple's. As sure as I can be of almost everything I do. Jane took a seat at the counter. There was no rush. There never was when it came to unravelling a tightly woven web. Jack Weston saw her, the night of the murder. A figure in light clothing, walking along the path to the well. He didn't know it then, but now he's convinced it was you. Silence settled like a stone in the middle of the counter. Edith didn't deny it. She didn't raise her voice. She just folded her hands on the wood and breathed slowly. I didn't mean to. I didn't, he sighed. I didn't go there to kill her. But I knew I was in danger. I sensed it. When I read that last page, I knew I'd reached the point of no return. Emma was going to talk. She was going to lay it all out, including me. Miss Marple remained silent. She let Edith continue. She knew that when someone finally decides to speak, it's best not to interrupt the flow of confession that has taken years to form. I wasn't Emma's closest friend, but when she came back to town, something about her manner drew me in. A well-contained sadness. A remorse that was familiar. We became close in the way women who don't quite fit their own moulds do. I knew about Tom before anyone else mentioned his name. I knew she saw him from afar sometimes. I knew that it hurt her more than she could admit. And you decided to protect her, Edith nodded. But she also feared that, by revealing everything, she would destroy something she herself had tried to build. Her silence had cost too much. The scandal would have devoured Tom Clare, the entire town. So it was you who took the diary. Yes, it wasn't Penelope. She just found a note Emma left before leaving the house. But I already had the diary. I went to give it back to her. I wanted to convince her to burn it, but by the time I got there, she was already hurt. Miss Marple blinked slowly. Was she alive? Edith lowered her head. Her fingers trembled on the cover of her notebook. Yes, barely. He looked at me and didn't say anything. He just slid the diary toward me, as if he knew I was the one who should have it, as if freeing me from his story. And he died, silently, with his eyes still open. And the statuette, it was there, on the floor. I don't know if the killer left it or if she was carrying it. I didn't ask. I just took it, along with the diary, and disappeared. I thought that would be enough to save everyone. I was wrong. Miss Marple stood up unhurriedly. Her voice was barely a whisper. What you did, Edith, wasn't killing, but you did hide, and that allowed the real killer to hide longer. Edith raised her face, and for the first time there was something like fear in her expression. So, you already know who it was? Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. She just watched the grandfather clock, which was ticking softly to 6:11. I know who had the motive, who knew the lay of the land, who knew about the well, and who couldn't afford for that truth to come out. Edith put a hand to her chest. Are you going to tell the police? I'll do something better. I'm going to invite everyone over for tea at my house tomorrow afternoon. Even the murderer? Especially the murderer, Miss Marple said with a slight smile. Because in a brightly lit drawing room, surrounded by butter cookies and jasmine tea, masks slip more easily than under the most severe cross-examination. And without adding anything else, she left the bookstore, leaving behind a broken woman who had tried to save everyone, except herself. Chapter 12. The Cup That Never Empty. Miss Marple's sitting room was neat and bright, with the embroidered white tablecloth spread across the centre table, the china arranged with precision, and a tray of freshly baked scones poised in perfect balance. At 5 o'clock sharp, the guests began to arrive. Claire Morley, pale but dignified, was the first. Tom Hughes arrived shortly after, his head down and bewildered, as if he still didn't understand why he had been summoned. Penelope Hartley entered silently, avoiding the other's gaze. Edith Benton was the last to arrive, her pace slower than usual. Jack Weston did not attend, at Miss Marple's express request. "Thank you all for coming," Jane said, pouring the tea with calm hands. "I know it's been a difficult week, but there are times when a cup of tea can reveal more than a sworn statement." Those present exchanged tense glances, though no one spoke. Miss Marple took her cup, settled into her favourite armchair, and continued in a calm voice. This story began with a nighttime stroll and a figure fallen near the well, a death that seemed unwitnessed, with no clear motive, but which soon revealed a web of intertwined secrets. He paused to add sugar to his cup, as if talking about the weather. Emma Lancaster was a woman who lived with a difficult truth. A hidden son, a daughter raised in resentment, and a community that doesn't easily forgive women's mistakes. But what killed her wasn't guilt, but the fear of others. Claire's eyes closed for a moment, as if the word guilt brushed past her. Everyone here knew some part of that truth. Penelope found a letter. Edith, the diary. Jack, the memory. Even Tom, unknowingly, carried the legacy of that past in his face. But one of you went further. One of you saw in the revelation not only scandal, but personal threat. Miss Marple put her cup down on its saucer and looked at Edith, who nodded slowly. Edith hid the diary, not to cover up a crime, but to protect what was left of Emma. Penelope arrived late, and Jack, he simply carried a remorse that wasn't his own. No, the killer was someone who knew where Emma would be that night, who knew her routines, who knew she went to the well every Wednesday at the same time, and who, after confronting her, hit her with the statuette in an act of desperation rather than hatred. Claire looked up. Her lips pursed. Tom, beside her, tensed. You, Claire, were seen arguing with Emma days earlier. You sent her a threat. You knew about the child. You felt betrayed. But you didn't kill her. You just wanted answers. Claire let out a shaky breath. Then who? He asked in a low voice. Miss Marple turned to the only person who had not moved throughout the entire encounter. Tom! The young man looked at her, bewildered. Me? I don't understand. Emma wrote in her diary that she wanted to tell him the truth. Jack confirmed that she asked him to find him if anything happened to her. But you, Tom, knew before then. You knew when you saw the painting. You knew when you found that letter with no return address, the one you never should have opened, the one that said, "You are my son." Tom stood up, livid. What are you saying? That you went looking for her that night. You wanted answers. She didn't deny it, but she didn't tell you everything. Maybe she hesitated. Maybe she said something that made you feel abandoned. You didn't plan it. But in that moment, you lost control. The silence in the room became unbearable. Tom took a step back, his hands shaking. I wasn't going to hurt him. I just wanted him to tell me, to look me in the eyes. But he didn't. He said he wasn't ready, that he didn't owe me. His voice broke. She told me it was the best thing for me, that it was out of love. Love? She left me in the hands of a woman who barely knew my name. And then she expected me to forgive her just because she was sorry. Claire brought a hand to her mouth. Tom, you're my brother. He looked at her, confused, then hurt. And why didn't anyone tell me? Miss Marple came closer and spoke softly. Because silence is a custom as old as this people. But when it turns into fear, it no longer protects. It kills. The police arrived minutes later, alerted in advance by Jane, who always knew the killer would speak, not with a confession, but with desperation. And so he did. At dusk, the town returned to its calm. The rain had stopped. The damp streets reflected the streetlights, as if it had all been a theatrical set, now dismantled. Miss Marple, alone in her garden, cleared the empty cups from the table. All but one. The one Tom had left half empty, the cup that was never emptied, like words left unspoken, like truths that wait too long. And as she put away the dishes, she thought, with the quiet sadness that only age allows, that justice is rarely perfect, but at least sometimes it's served on time.